Alright, working on the turbo Camaro today. I did end up getting the strange brakes for it and just working on that project now. It's been a little bit of a pain in the butt, and I'll explain to you guys why that's been. So basically, if you remember, those are the LT1 style brakes that I adapted to this GM 8.5 10-volt rear end. So I was able to use the LT1 style rear brakes with modifying that bracket. I just cut it out like a C. Well, the reason why I had to do that is because the C-clip eliminators, if you look through there, you can see them. They mount there. So that becomes the problem. They do not make a strange brake setup for these Mosier axles with these Mosier C-clip eliminators. So basically your bracket, you cannot find a caliper bracket like this that'll work with these C-clip eliminators. So I figured that out and I knew that, so I just ordered the strange brakes for like a 7.5 10-volt LT1 style Camaro rear end. That's what these brakes are. And that gives me this bracket. So I was figuring if I could adapt these LT1 brakes to this rear end, then I should be able to adapt the strange replacements for those brakes. Well, kind of no and kind of yes. It was a lot more difficult than what I expected, and I really had to plan this thing out because there was a lot of factors here working against me, but I was able to finally get it all to work, thankfully, but was definitely more than what I was expecting. I'll start off with some of the simple stuff. Is one thing, this rotor, this hat thickness right here is about 90 thousandths. It's either 90 or 100 thousandths thinner than that rotor. So that's going to move my tire and wheel in that 90 to 100 thousandths. Not that big of a deal as long as you have clearance. Well, I had one spot right there that it would already rub a little bit, so simple enough. Honestly, just took a hammer and beat that back a little more, so I knew we were going to be good there. That was simple. Well, now the next problem became getting this bracket to work. First step is, if you see my bracket's cut out like a C, this one is as well, but this will not fit over the axle tube. So what I had to do is I cut this bracket right down that seam to just cut this ear off. That way it dropped down. So I'll show you guys that. So if you look, that ear has actually been cut right there, and that allows me to get my bracket on. Well, then the problem was, if you look, the offset was wrong, because with this mounted flush up against the back of the housing here, right there, well then my offset's about 280 thousandths out towards me, which is not in the center here for my caliper. So that was obviously a problem. And if you guys look, you can kind of see what I already did, is I actually got a machined spacer for each spot. So the chrome spacer is 250 thousandths, and the one behind that is either 40 or 50 thousandths, so we're right in that like 280 to 300 thousandths worth of shim. And that's what I did. So I put that 280 to 300 thousandths worth of shim there to get my bracket on the right center line for the rotor. And I'll show you guys a couple things with that. One thing you want to make sure is your pads are loose, they don't have any apply, that there's not dragging on the rotor, which they're not. But then the other thing you want to look at is to make sure it's centered in that slot. And it's kind of hard to see. To make sure you got space on both sides. And you can see that actually worked out perfect. We're right in the center of the caliper, so our rotor's centered up. So that's kind of what we did, but that was just a lot to figure out and come up with that. Now, with that being said, I got bolts that were longer to go into my C-clip eliminators here. And I actually got them a 1/2 inch longer, even though I only added about 280 to 300 thousandths. So we got 200 thousandths more thread in our C-clip eliminator, which I feel good about that. And then I use blue Loctite on these and washers on the back side as well. And then if you look here, we use a hardened washer that they provided right there. And then I red Loctited these bolts in. I just like to use red Loctite, especially on a bolt like this, because if these back out, they'll get into the rotor. And that's one thing you'll notice is they use these calipers a couple different ways, mounting them like this, or how this setup was originally, this bracket would be mounted on this side over here. So when you flip them like that, you've got to make sure the bolt comes in from this side. Because if you were to put the bolt in from this side, it'd be wanting to pull that steel, I'd call it like a nutsert, out. If you go from this side, you can see it's got the aluminum to hold it in. So we wanted to make sure we used the right bracket for the right side, and then how this is machined out here actually worked out perfect, because that's where the factory axle tube is welded, and that gave us the clearance we needed inside of there. So I used the bracket that I used on this side for this side because of that. So this one will go for the other side. That way it'll mount up correctly. Our bolts will go through and be pulling from the right side. So it all worked out. That's the long story short, but it was definitely a bit of a battle. One thing I may do, if you look, I bolted that ear back on just for additional support, which I never did with the original brackets. I just left it off. I thought about doing it, but that's a big cast iron heavy bracket there, so I wasn't too concerned. With this one, what I may do is have this TIG welded right there where it's cut, and just TIG weld that to make that bracket whole again. You won't be able to remove it, but it doesn't really bother me. I could always cut the weld if I need to take it off. But that'd give me some additional support. The other thing I thought about doing is having a machined spacer made for this, but honestly, after going through it all, getting it all tightened up, I'm pretty darn confident in this. I actually like the way it turned out, so I'm not too concerned about that. I think if anything, I'll just have that one tab TIG welded, but this thing is freaking rock solid, so it's the whole car shaking there. Super happy with it. Came out really well. I've just got to go ahead and do the other side, then make up some lines, and we should shed hopefully around that like 25 to 27 pounds. But yeah, I'm happy with it. I'm excited. I was super nervous, and you can imagine, you know, a $650 brake kit, and you break out the saw and start cutting up the brackets. But in this application, we just didn't have a choice. They don't make a setup for this. One thing I would recommend is, I don't know why Strange just doesn't make a 3-eared bracket to go on the backside like we did. And it would just have to have a little bit of a jog, so that 280 to 300 thousandths jog in it, and that would work perfect. Now, if they're concerned with making that bracket only 3-eared made out of aluminum, I understand that. Just make it out of steel, 3-eared with a 280 to 300 thousandths jog in it. And then that eliminates any of the issues with people that have old C-clip eliminator axles on any of your 10 volts or 12 volt stuff. And if you guys look it up, you'll notice several companies do make brackets like that out of steel that are 3-eared to go on the backside for this reason. Strange nor Mosier, to my knowledge, makes anything in the lightweight drag brake setup. So that's why we didn't go with one of the kits that was 3-eared, is they're all the big GM style. They're just a real heavy brake like what we were already using. So it seems pretty simple to me to just engineer a steel bracket off the backside with a jog in it, or a different rotor offset, and it could be a straight bracket. I don't know why they don't do that, because then that eliminates all the headache of figuring out what axle offset and C-clip eliminators customers have. Now, some are still going to be different, so the customers will still need to get a measurement from the face to the axle flange, but then you know what you're dealing with every single time. You just measure from the face of here to your axle flange, and you can just have a offset bracket. And the other thing I did notice is they do make, for the 3-yeared steel brackets, shims for that. So that'd be the exact recipe there. If customers have, a 20 or 30 thousandths difference, or even 40 or 60 thousandths difference, you could just have different thickness shims to make the offset correct, like what we did here. Just my thoughts there. I would imagine they're going to come up with something sooner or later to do something very similar to what we did here, but for now, we just had to make this work, and I'm happy with it. The caliper's nice and fixed tight. I'm not worried about it at all. Our pads are nice and centered in the rotor. Our caliper's centered in the rotor. We did blue Loctite on the C-clip eliminator bolts, red Loctite on the caliper bolts. I'm pretty happy with it. So if you guys have any questions, just comment. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Keep it saucy. Thanks.